On Grady Hill by Brent Noury. Read by Brent Noury. Chapter 1. The Festival for Samuel Grady. Evangeline's Journal. Part 1. The road from Gentry Ford was a beautiful mix of summer flowers, overhanging tree limbs, flowing streams running along, making their own music against the rocks and shores, winding along the side of Grady Hill. The last few miles is where the train tracks would meet up again and run parallel to the road. We could hear the most beautiful sounds coming into Utopia every year on Samuel Grady Day, the festival for my granddaddy. Every year, since I can remember, we would take this same ride in, the whole family. Daddy is Grandpa Samuel's youngest son. We would meet up with the whole Grady and Haven clan and ride up to visit Grandma Astrid. But first was always the best part, riding into the festival on Haven Street, as we're just starting to now, passing by Hospitality Manor. Miss Candace is out there as usual, waving and having guests. She's had quite a hard year with Mr. Anglo passing. Utopia was as perfect as you could imagine it being. Every person seemed to be in the streets, bustling around, setting up flowers and carts and events and food. Everyone in the area looked forward to visiting Utopia today. It was as if the birds orchestrated themselves a symphony just for the occasion. We met up with Mrs. Haven and some of the Gentrys and more Havens. Then Dada finally saw Uncle Adam and his boys, and so the whole Grady family was together, except for Granny Astrid, who was waiting up hilltop. As we worked our wagon down Haven Street, Daddy and Uncle Adam greeted a lot of the familiar faces, and their conversations would get going. That's when us children would get our chance to experience Samuel Grady Day. We'd run off down Haven and look in every cart and see the performers getting ready for the town show. By mid-morning, I was already stuffed with treats, and then, of course, the Charleston boys would show up and ruin everything. Old Man Winston II had a way of immediately getting Dada upset. He really couldn't stand to be around him. Uncle Adam would be cordial and indulge Mr. Charleston with whatever business he had in his head, and Daddy himself would slip off with Mama to get a popcorn and watch the town show. We didn't care much for our generation of Charlestons neither. Winston III had to be just about the meanest, vilest boy I'd met. And it would usually come down to the mountainside boys finally having enough Charleston chew, as we called it, and the boys would come to blows. This time, though, Winston made a remark about chipping into our mountain, and something dumb like Miss Anglo is finally giving up that house she never should have. And that was enough to get Winston socked in the face by Clyde Grady, Uncle Adam's eldest. Them being the same age and all, Clyde and Winston been fighting for years. The marching band was blaring in the background as the Grady and Haven boys were squaring up with the Charlestons again. A usual laughable entertainment for us girls as we took in the whole scene. The festival was in full bloom. Finally the boys quit as Daddy, Uncle Adam, and Mrs. Haven rounded everyone up for the trip up the hill to Topside, where Grammy would be waiting. Grandpa Samuel had been passed for some years now, even before I was born. So Grammy had been living up top hillside by her lonesome for quite a time, with only field help around and her boys visiting. I suppose Mrs. Haven visited often too, but sometime the trek up Grady Hill can be much to bear for folks. Many an accident has happened or near accident. Grammy always tells her story filled with as many tragedies as laughs. Riding up Grady Hill, overlooking the festival, always gives me such a feeling of pride in my family. You can't help but think about the history of it as we make our way to Jacqueline Turn, the scariest part of both the ascent and descent of the ride. Many of us would hop off the wagons and walk the rest of the way to save the horses at this point. Granny would surely make mention of dear Miss Jacqueline in her story. We would make our way up to Hilltop, just as Granny Astrid and Grandpa Samuel had done many times and Dada as a boy. We would all find Granny in the cabin, readying lunch and a good fire in the Grady fireplace many had sat at before. Dada and Uncle Adam off in another room or walking the farm discussing Charleston's latest ploy, and the rest of us will gather around the fire for Granny's annual story about the town, the mountain, the people in it, and Grandpa Samuel's dream of Utopia. Grandma Astrid begins her story. Now, I'm going to begin by saying this story is not all happiness and good times. In fact, it took a lot of suffering and hardship for your daddy, uncle, grandfather, great-grandfather, Samuel Grady, to get this here festival named after him. This town was built out of what Samuel used to call a mountain of dreams. Utopia would be the thing to rest in the bosom of the mountain, waiting to bathe in sunlight and sleep in shadow. Now Samuel grew up as an only child, but that's sadly not the whole story, because he did have at one time an older sister, Jacqueline. That's why we call that part of the road coming up Hilltop Jacqueline Turn. When Samuel was 5, he was down in town with his daddy, Big Bill Grady. Big Bill was the town's most respected man. Did good for everyone. Anyhow, they were downtown, and as Samuel told me, he could see the edge of Hilltop, up here, where you can look down and see Haven Street. Jacqueline was like a shadow along the hilltop, he said, and then the shadow slid along the hillside and disappeared into the trees. Anyhow, that's how Samuel became an only child. And that's how Front Hilltop got changed to how it is now, where the fencing is above Jacqueline Turn. Mr. Big Bill Grady spent the next months carving out that part of Hilltop. From downtown, you could see him up there in that same silhouette, shoveling at the top of the mountain, trying to make it right again. Then, 2 years later, came the fire. It was the most pleasant evening to start. Samuel had just arrived back from school not 3 days prior for Christmas. Miss Candace Anglo and Mr. Anglo were throwing their annual holiday fair. Samuel and I were dancing to Mr. Jam Antono banging on that old piano Miss Candace keeps in the parlor, Hospitality Manor. We were both laughing and hoping for the snow to come down. As it were, that's when the cries from down Haven Street rang out. Big Bill, Mr. Anglo, Mr. Antono, my brother Titus, and my daddy all ran towards the cries. We hurried to follow. As we all got around the curve to see down Haven, half the town was ablaze. There's not much more I can remember once the fire began. My brother Titus barely survived, maiming the side of his face in the fire rescuing young Miss Adelaide Gentry. Then I remember Big Bill went back into the fire once more with Samuel watching in the street screaming. The building collapsed, killing Big Bill Grady. I watched Samuel scream and cry in the muddy streets as the rains finally arrived. He was as far then from Utopia as he would ever be. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 from On Grady Hill, read by Brent Noury. A funeral for a town. When people used to say Hardship Mountain was so poor, couldn't even afford the D for hardship, Samuel would say, in Latin, ET means and one day I'm going to put the ET in Hardship Mountain. And I'd say, just put the cross in it and you get hardship, and it's basically the same thing. And he'd get all riled up about my spelling his mountain all wrong, even though I was, and still am, a better speller and storyteller than he ever was. Then he'd say some quip like, well, maybe you are the shortcut to me and God. God and I'd say. Well, that's between you two, flower petals, which is what your grandfather would call me sometimes due to my name being Astrid. A funeral was held for all those who perished in the fire, including Big Bill Grady. The town fell into true hardship after that, as Big Bill had been the one to keep many townsfolk employed on his family's mountain. The other side of town, the side that was burned, was near Winston Charleston's land, and after the fire, he bought up all that part of town and employed all sorts of cheap labor. After the funeral, Mr. Samuel Grady went back to school for as long as his mama could hold out handling the top of Farm Hillside, leading out to where Gentry Ford is now. He came back at 17, we being the same age. But he stayed up hillside for years, rare never to come down those first years. Town folk were expecting another Big Bill to emerge. And at the time, young Samuel was a gloomy, sort of brooding fellow, very quiet, not like the younger Samuel we had all known. Later I'd find out he was working hilltop and keeping the farm going as Jem Ontono was getting sick. Jem was best friend to Big Bill Grady, and he and Miss Ontono had always been around when Samuel was young, and helped run the farm with Mrs. Heather, as we all called Samuel's mama after Big Bill died. Now this is the year we're talking about, the year of no more poor Jem Ontono, and the year Samuel Grady built Utopia.